In this video, I'll be talking about how we can evaluate logic in the AQ. So, in the previous video, I talked about how to tackle the AQ, how to write the introduction, body paragraph, and conclusion. If you haven't seen that video, I would recommend you to take a look at that before watching this video. Link will be in the description below. So, one of the main things that I discussed in the previous video was how evaluating logic in the AQ can give you a more balanced AQ and hence a higher mark. With some help, this will be very easy to do, and this video will be the first of a series of videos on how we can evaluate logic in the AQ. What I will be doing in these videos will be to go through various examples of how logic is evaluated and explain to you why or how we do that using the examples as a premise. So, let's begin with the first example. The writer seems to have a bone to pick with the fashion industry. Right from the start, his sole example of the Nike trainers is cherry-picked to make a sweeping statement about the entire fashion industry. Arguably, this is a broad generalization based on an isolated example. So, how are we evaluating logic in this sentence? Can you notice that we use the terms bone to pick, cherry-picked, sweeping statement, and broad generalization based on an isolated example? Right? So, by using the phrase bone to pick, we are trying to say that we feel like the writer had something against the topic that he was writing about, which is the fashion industry in this case. But when we do this, do remember that we have to substantiate why in the later portion of our answer. So in the next part of this example, we say that the writer only used a single example about the Nike trainers in order to make a comment on an entire industry. So the fact that he only used a single example to make a point about an industry as large as the fashion industry should ring a bell in our head. Why is he doing this? Whenever someone tries to write an argument in their essay, they will usually give multiple examples in order to elaborate and substantiate their point, right? Because of this, we can argue that the example chosen by the writer is cherry-picked in order for him to make his point. So ultimately, we can argue that whatever the writer writes about the industry is a sweeping statement because of this single example that he uses to generalize a whole industry. Hence, in the last part of our example, we write that this is a broad generalization given that there is only one isolated example. So do use this framework if you ever see this in your comprehension passage, when the writer only uses one isolated example to make all his points. Now, moving on to the next example. The writer does not cite any authority from the sustainability industry to corroborate the accuracy and veracity of his claims. The writer's only examples were merely citing information from insiders, resulting in a lack of credible evidence. So this is another instance where we attack the problem with the writer's examples. The terms that we should take note of in this example should be does not cite any authority to corroborate the accuracy and veracity, and lastly, lack of credible evidence. So, whenever we write or whenever we try to craft an argument, we should always provide credible examples, which are examples from recognized organizations or by prominent figures. Right? For instance, if we want to make an argument about economics, one is more likely to believe an article who cites an economic professor from the University of Harvard rather than an economics student who still hasn't graduated from junior college. In terms of organizations, one can even cite studies done by renowned organizations or international organizations such as the World Bank or firms such as Deloitte, which are famous for their research. So, these are ways that we use credible examples. And because the writer does not use any of this, we can argue that the writer lacks a source of credible evidence in his essay, since whatever he is criticizing or claiming is only backed by insiders, which he has not even named. So, what does he mean by insiders, right? Who can confirm that the examples or information that he provides is even true? The term insider information that he uses is not enough. Even I can say that I have insider information that the A-levels would be cancelled for the next 10 years. But who will believe me when I say that? Hence, by not citing any form of authority, the writer has made a very weak argument, which is what we are going to attack. So, this is a way that we can attack the writer's arguments, where we say that he does not have any credible examples, rendering his examples weak. Feel free to use this framework if you ever realize that the writer's arguments are all anecdotal, fluffy, unsubstantiated, or does not come from a credible source. Now, the third example that we are going through would be, in suggesting that parental influence shackles children's life choices, the writer seems to be overstating the case, failing to consider that as children mature, they increasingly have the ability and are able to make their own choices, especially in this day and age. So, in this case, we argue by stating that we think that although the phenomenon that the writer is talking about might be true, he seems to be overstating or understating his case. This will also allow you to have your own personal voice in the response, because you are essentially stating that the writer's opinion is this, but your opinion is otherwise, which is why you are trying to argue that the writer is either overstating, as we have used in the example, or understating his case. So, if you look at this example, the train of thought goes like this. We argue that the writer's case, that parental influence shackles children's life choices, is an overstatement, right? So we go on by explaining even more by saying that we feel like as children mature, they would have more ability and awareness to make their own choices, especially today. This part is very important. Do note that we can't just say that the writer has overstated his case. We also have to explain why we think that the writer overstated his case. Simply stating that the writer overstates or understates something is not enough. You could even argue using other reasons, right? Why he overstated his case. Perhaps whether parents affects children's life choices could also depend on culture. Maybe we could talk about the tiger mom culture in Asian countries or Chinese families, and also relate this to the Singapore society later on. This will also give you points. Hence, do feel free to use this framework to evaluate, as long as you have a reason to explain the overstatement or understatement, and you know how to explain why you think so. So, another interesting thing we can note from this example is that if you read the above example again, can you tell what else we can use to attack the writer's point? Do you realize that he uses the word shackle? The word shackle could be over-exaggerating the situation, and it gives us the imagery that parents literally shackle their children. We could say that the writer is using emotive language. So, what is emotive language? I will go through this with the use of the next example. Now, the final example would be the writer's use of emotive language to disparage the sports industry paints an exaggerated picture of their influence, making his claims dubious. So, in this case, we attack the writer's use of emotive language to undermine his claims or to doubt the veracity of his claims. We are arguing that his claims are dubious because he is using emotive language, which results in us questioning his motive. So, usually when people use emotive language, what they are trying to do is that they are trying to make the situation seem more significant or serious than it already is, and is a form of exaggeration. Sometimes emotive language is used to provoke the audience, and the writer might be doing this in order to go for some sort of audience manipulation or emotional manipulation. So, let me use a very common example to try to explain this concept of emotive language. Let's say that a company reduces an employee's salary by $10, right? And this employee originally was earning $10,000 a month. So, this reduction of $10 is actually a very small amount to him. However, this person goes around saying that the company slashed his salary, right? So the fact that he used the word slashed is emotive language. It makes you seem that the situation is worse than it originally is. What he should have said was the company reduced his salary. His initial salary of $10,000 a month was reduced by $10. That is by no means slashing of his salary. This example might be slightly far-fetched, but you get my point. Emotive language tend to make a situation more significant than it is and evoke an emotion in the reader. Some writers even try to play with or manipulate the reader's emotions. Back to the example, so we are attacking the writer's use of emotive language. So, perhaps in the essay, the writer wrote something along the lines of this. The sports industry wields absolute control over their fans. They charge their fans exorbitant amounts for a game day ticket, or even a shirt or a cap, which is in fact daylight robbery. If this sentence appears in the comprehension passage that you are reading, do immediately realize that this is an opportunity for us to attack the fact that the author is using emotive language, the fact that he uses words such as absolute control, exorbitant, and daylight robbery, shows that he might and is trying to evoke this imagery of the sports industry robbing people of their money. These four examples are all ways that we can use to attack the writer's logic in the AQ, and by attacking logic, it is a way that we can evaluate or even use this logic to disagree with the writer. If you want more of such content, do remember to subscribe, as I'll be making more such videos of examples of how we can evaluate logic in the AQ.